Hey everybody, this is Billy from Writers. So I was a little bit bored and I wanted to do a video anyway. So I put out a feeler on Writers on Tumblr to say, hey, who wants to send in a question for me to do a video on? So I did get one from Made of Eccentricity on Tumblr. And what they write is, for the writing question video, how do you find a balance between too much and too little foreshadowing? I love to stick little hints into my writing, but I sometimes worry that A, nobody will see those hints, even on a second read, or B, they'll be so obvious that everyone will guess at the ending way before it actually happens. All right, so this is a pretty big question because there's so many times in writing that you have foreshadowing and you want to have that balance. You don't want your readers to know what's happening too soon, but you also want to give those little hints and say maybe somebody will figure this out. Or better yet, when they get done reading it, they can go back and go like, wow, how did I miss that thing? It was right there. They spelled it out. And so that's kind of the fun part of foreshadowing. But let's talk for a second about what foreshadowing actually is. So when you're writing, sometimes you want to give a little hint in the story about what's going to happen down the road. And it's not really, like setting a hint down and walking away from it and hoping that somebody picks it up. It's more about, like, during the story you may have a moment where something happens earlier in the story that ties in and makes a connection to what happens later on. And that's really where foreshadowing comes in. But let's talk for a minute then about when foreshadowing actually makes sense in a story in terms of the narration. So you probably weren't going to expect me to talk about tenses or about the narration when we're talking about foreshadowing, but it's an important thing to think about and to look at. All right, so in your story, while you're writing, you've got your characters that you have that are part of the story. However, there's another character in the story who's the narration, the narrative voice, and that narrator is the one that tells you what's happening, that gives you the information that you need to know. Now that narrator has a bunch of different options that they can have. So first you talk about the person. Is it a first person narration? Is it second or is it third? So first person is, I'm talking about my own story and talking about what's happening or what has happened. Second person is, when you write it, you're actually talking to the reader and putting them in the story. So saying, you went to the door and you opened up the refrigerator and you did this and you did that, or you will do this, or you did do this, which is very difficult to write in. And I wouldn't recommend it unless you've got a lot of experience in writing. The third person is somebody that's outside of the story that does the narration, and that's that's typically in fiction is more of that. More often it is third person. So whichever person you're working with, though, then you need to look at when they're telling the story, right? So are they telling it in the present? Are they telling it in the past? There can be a future tense as well that's a little trickier, just like second person. But do I know that, am I going through the events now, or am I talking about the events in the past? And then you also have how much the narrator knows. So you may have, say you have a cast of many characters, right, that are the main characters. With that, if you're working with third person, well, if you're working with first person, you can only have a limited understanding in present tense, right? So if I'm talking about what I did or what I'm doing right now, then I can only talk about that in the present tense. I can only talk about it from my own perspective. But if I'm talking about something that happened in the past, if I'm using the past tense, then I have access to that information. A third person narrator can have access to all the information as well. But again, you can also limit the understanding. So I may be a third person narrator, but I may only be able to see inside of one person's head and understand what's happening from their perspective. So now let's get back to the idea of foreshadowing. All right. So with that, if you're working from the narrator's perspective and you're working with foreshadowing that's happening in the narration, if you're doing a first person, that's a little, well, if you're doing a first person present tense, then it's, that narration shouldn't have access to the information about what happened already. So that narrator can't talk about something that's foreshadowing, right? And then if you're a limited perspective in the narration, then that's going to make it more difficult to foreshadow as well. But the narrator can provide foreshadowing that can get a little bit heavy-handed. What I prefer, tend to prefer, is where the action of the story provides that foreshadowing. So perhaps something happens at the end of the story that is mirrored by an action that happens earlier in the story. So maybe, I'm trying to think of a good example, just a second. Okay, I got a good example. Hopefully you've seen a movie called Stranger Than Fiction. It's a Will Ferrell movie. It's brilliant, and it's great for people who are writers and want to focus on writing. In the story, Will Ferrell plays a character named Harold Crick, who is an IRS agent who's an extremely boring human being. And the narration in the story talks about how boring he is and how he gets up every morning and he brushes his teeth a specific way, up and down 32 times and side to side 32 times. And suddenly Harold Crick stops and says, "Who said that? Who said that Harold Crick brushes his teeth up and down 32 times and side to side 32 times?" He actually hears the narration, which isn't really about the foreshadowing, but at one point early on in the beginning, something happens to his watch, and the voice says, "Little did he know that that would be the cause of his death." And this is just as he's getting ready to climb onto a bus. And I actually, rather than give away the end of the movie, just know that that has something significant to tie in with the ending of the story. But that moment is foreshadowing. And the author is able to foreshadow because the author knows what's going to happen in the book. Well, not quite, but that's something you'll see in the movie if you haven't seen it already. Anyway, so when you foreshadow, you want to do a couple of things. Okay, so now we get to the actual question. And I'm sorry that it took so long to get to this point, but you got to get some stuff set up. All right, so when you are foreshadowing, first off, you have to know what you're foreshadowing when you put it in. So say I'm writing off the seat of my pants and I just put in, oh, so-and-so, little did he know that this would be this. Putting in that without knowing what it is not good foreshadowing. That's the kind of thing that you want to go back. Like I finished the story, now I can go back and put in these details. And actually, I think that's really where you want to look at. So rather than, as I'm writing, with no clue what's going on, putting in these details that may or may not mean anything. That is going to be counterproductive to your foreshadowing. Instead, feel free to write those in, with the understanding that they may not pan into anything. And that's one of the details. Sorry, let me finish with what I just started. Those are in there, but they may or may not mean anything. And that's where you run into the complication of, saying too much, saying too little, giving it away too fast, not giving it away fast enough. So if you're just writing and you just put things in, then that will make things easier to make it so that your foreshadowing isn't, one, telegraphed, but also that it feels natural. And when you go back and you put in those couple of little foreshadowing details, you're not trying to make it happen. Whereas if you put them in while you're writing your rough draft or your first draft or your second draft, then you're forcing those details in with the idea that it's going to happen. Whereas instead, if you come at it from the back end after you've written a draft or two, then you can say, this is where I can put this in, just set it here on the sidewalk and maybe somebody will see it and pick it up. Maybe they won't. But if they know later on, when they come back, they should be able to find those notes. It's the same kind of thing that happens a lot in a murder mystery kind of story, where the clues are there, but the clues aren't really put in until after the story's written. And then, you know, the author can go back and go, okay, I can make this a little more obvious, I can make this a little less obvious, and make sure that people understand what's going on. All right, so there you go. Hopefully that answers your question in a way that works for you. If you want follow up on it, just let me know. I'll pop up the blog name, writers.tumblr.com. You can go right into the ask for that. I will also pop up my the email address for the website, or well, for this channel, up in the corner as well. If you have other questions, let us know. Thank you.